Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Thinktank.
A warm welcome to Mena-Watch. My name is Jasmine Aremi, and today I have the pleasure of hosting Noam Petri and Franziska Sittig. These two have written a book, Intellectual Self-Destruction, which we will discuss today. And currently, it is the case that the Western academic sector finds itself at a crossroads, moving away from critical research and toward politically motivated radicalization. And in doing so, the book positions itself as both a wake-up call and a plea for the defense of the Enlightenment legacy against ideological appropriation. A brief introduction for you both. Noam Petri, you are currently a medical student at Berlin's Charité and served as the vice president of the Jewish Student Union. You write for the Jüdische Allgemeine, for Cicero, for Die Welt, and for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and you are also known for your numerous lectures. You have received multiple awards for your dedication, including the Frankfurt Citizens Prize for Volunteer Engagement and the Benny Bloch Prize. It's truly wonderful to have you with us today. And Franziska, you completed your master's degree in International Relations and European Politics at Columbia University in New York in the fall of 2024, with a focus on terrorism and Islamism. You're a journalist, writing regularly for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Die Zeit, Jüdische Allgemeine, Cicero, and Focus Money. Among other things, you also won the 2016 Young Talent Award from Die Zeit. It's great to have you here. Let's move to the first question, concerning your book's title, The Intellectual Self-Destruction. What exactly do you mean? Who is self-destructing, and in what way?
Thus, by intellectual self-destruction, we contend that Western civilization, particularly its intellectual elites, is essentially undermining its own foundations. Rather than defending freedom, pluralism, reason, and rationality, they are adopting narratives grounded in self-hatred and the delegitimization of the West. And it doesn't matter if these narratives have Islamist, communist, decolonial, or morally relativistic origins. Regardless of where they come from, all these ideologies are united by a hatred for Western civilization, which systematically infiltrates our educational institutions and media policy to delegitimize our Western values. Our book specifically focuses on how this happens at universities precisely in those spaces that should actually be places of constructive debate and enlightenment.
One must understand this whole phenomenon as a developmental process where the civilizational self-destruction that everyone is essentially experiencing, whether on a cultural or economic foundation, has, according to our thesis, an underlying intellectual self-destruction as its basis. This suggests that if a society is culturally, civilizationally, and economically self-destructing, then there must be an underlying idea driving at that. Ultimately compels or motivates the political elite to either take certain steps or to refrain from taking them, which ultimately brings us to the current situation we find ourselves in. And our theory is, first comes the intellectual self-destruction, and then the self-destruction in real life.
We'll definitely delve into that more deeply. Was there a particular pivotal experience for both of you that prompted you to feel, hey, this is something we simply must address in a book?
Well, we both followed the developments across the Atlantic, me in New York, Noam in Berlin. What transpired in the US, not just at my university, Columbia University, but across other universities, quickly made its way to Germany and Europe. We discussed it thoroughly and recognized that these were indeed identical scenarios, patterns, and phenomena. And when I was subsequently prohibited from writing my master's thesis on Islamism in Germany at Columbia, essentially experiencing academic censorship, while other students freely roamed the campus with pro-Hamas posters, it became clear to me that once I finished my studies and departed from Columbia, action needed to be taken, and this situation had to be documented.
And for me, that moment essentially arrived when I understood that the occupations in Berlin were consistently executed by the same factions, and that the evidence detailing their ideological underpinnings was quite manifest, as was the violence they not only condone but also commit. And yet this is happening in academia, but also within the political sphere. and generally in the media the topic was actually addressed with very little enthusiasm. People failed to grasp what was truly happening or effective in that situation and the profound consequences it is already incurring and will continue to have in the immediate future. And that's why we decided once again completely whoever reads the book will see to present the series of events chronologically. We mainly focused on Berlin and New York, specifically Columbia University, but we also paint a broader picture with various examples. Who are these groups? Who are they connected to and who provides their funding? In which reports are they actually listed? And how do the media report about it? Or do the media report on it incorrectly, or perhaps not at all?
I believe you've concisely summarized it. I also consider your book a highly significant work in this context, simply because it thoroughly reveals all these connections and networks, which are also evident as active participants in various other domains, including protest organizations here in Germany. You also describe in your book that large parts of the academic and intellectual discourse in Germany and Europe are currently caught in a kind of intellectual self-destruction. Where is that most evident right now?
That's a good question, where it's most evident specifically. Essentially, the phenomenon we are describing is, for example, that at the Free University, among approximately 1,000 lecturers based in Berlin, whether all of them are Berlin lecturers is open to debate, but in any case nearly all of them are German lecturers, or lecturers who teach in Germany, who are signing an open letter that demands that students, allegedly students, many of whom are not actually enrolled, should remain unpunished when they occupy a university. And during that process they call for violence, specifically for an intifada. Then we realize that something is seriously amiss there. And it becomes particularly evident that something is wrong when the same groups repeatedly occupy university lecture halls just a few weeks afterward. This occurred at the HU, resulting in €150,000 worth of damage. A few weeks later, they launched an attack on the university administration, injuring a staff member, then reoccupied Humboldt University, and did likewise at the ASH. These connections are quite clear. Who are these groups exactly? And yet not a single one of these professors or lecturers chooses to publicly assert that the defense of this organization and these students was entirely mistaken. Even though that's actually what the academic sector should be, because the academic sector is in fact the one that should be most self-critical. That is precisely what science entails, self-correction. But something is going wrong there. And that is one of the examples we highlight in the book. However, one can frame the issue more broadly and state that there was likely a completely erroneous or excessively biased view of migration policy, an overly one-sided perspective on identity politics. Or rather, the majority concentrated on specific topics, while other opinions were not fully censored, but rather tacitly censored or suppressed. And we're essentially demonstrating that this particular issue represents a significant sub-problem, a substantial part problem within a much broader movement.
Absolutely. When considering the political aspect, if we momentarily divert our attention from academia, there's something I would personally describe as suicidal empathy. What always struck me, even well before October 7th, and what I found intriguing, was that in Europe and partly in the USA, when there was an Islamist terrorist attack, for instance, certain media and opinion leaders would assert that we shouldn't dwell on our own recently endured trauma, the one the nation had just suffered, but rather on the trauma of the terrorist who had just killed people. So what the majority of society thinks and feels becomes irrelevant. Instead, we are told we must consider the person's background, that they must have experienced something terrible to do such a thing. And what's even worse is the idea that these attacks are merely components of a broader Muslim grievance, implying that the West ought to make even greater efforts to integrate Muslims more effectively. Essentially, it suggests that such attacks are fundamentally the West's fault, rather than being attributable to the individual perpetrators themselves or the radical ideology that underpins their actions. And as Noam already said, on a micro level, we see this in academia in the US. To provide a further illustration, we encountered certain professors at my university and also at other institutions who for decades, well in advance of October 7th, had characterized Israel and Jews as, shall we say, vermin and beasts, explicitly employing such terms to label Israelis and Jews, and they, who have experienced no censorship, are still permitted to teach at Columbia, are still allowed to promote these theories, and would still label October 7th as a wonderful occasion. And many universities in the US don't stand up against that.
One central aspect of your book is the way many intellectuals and university lecturers approach the topic of Israel. This isn't a new subject, something the three of us are likely very conscious of. But why are these intellectual elites so susceptible to this particular narrative, this specific anti-Israeli narrative? Did you notice anything in your research that is perhaps a bit clearer now than it was 20 years ago?
Well, it is the guiding principle of the West in that sense. It's no coincidence that this academia labels Israel as the white colonial state. The term, after all, originates from academia, or rather, it is either heavily promoted and charged by those groups, or they attempt to rationalize it scientifically. You brought it up. Are intellectuals truly susceptible to radical ideas? I believe they are. We've seen that before in history, how a large number of intellectuals, for example, also stood behind Stalin and generally criminal regimes. Jean-Paul Sartre is a major, well-known example who was nevertheless famous, although, as we show in our book, positioned themselves behind such regimes. Intelligence doesn't necessarily always result in sound judgments, or rather, to the correct decisions. Unfortunately, it also facilitates the rationalization of erroneous choices and incorrect viewpoints to align with one's existing framework. And correspondingly, if one examines why the academic movement is so focused on Israel, then I consider that fundamentally the wrong focus, because the academic movement isn't only concentrated on Israel, but it also has an enemy, and that is often quite openly the West. The West, which is depicted as inherently evil in the post-colonial context. The world is divided into good and evil, and Israel is considered part of that. And Israel, of course, is considered the ultimate adversary and arch-enemy of this movement, precisely because Israel is a European, Western-influenced state, a nation-state that stands firm, defending itself amidst surrounding adversaries, and is committed to preserving its national character. And that is, of course, a thorn in the side of those people who fundamentally wish to see the self-dissolution of the West, and consequently of Israel as well. Given that the West is unfortunately in the process of dissolving itself, Israel becomes a thorn in their side precisely because Israel refuses to jump off the bridge, unlike numerous other Western nation-states. And are all academics of this opinion? No, we don't mean that, and the argument isn't binding. We ask, what is a powerful current? And the major issue is that despite the fact that academics are supposed to be brave and self-critical, a significant number of them, for various reasons such as opportunism, cowardice, or simply disinterest, align themselves with certain movements and that is why we have arrived at this point where we stand today, the very topic we are discussing here.
And compared to Western countries, as Noam already said, Israel clearly names the problem. Israel specifically states that radical Islamism, Hamas, and numerous occurrences in Arab nations constitute the problem, presenting an existential threat to Israel and aiming to pose a similar threat to the West in the future. However, if the West doesn't clearly articulate the problems and never states what's truly causing us to already be engaging in certain struggles within our societies, Israel is actively combating it. It is compelled to do so, being encircled by numerous adversaries. So Israel is not playing the nice guy. But that is precisely why many Western academics are so furious with Israel, because it fundamentally doesn't conform to the West's code of behavior. And besides, as we've noted and consistently emphasized in the book, anti-Semitism has always been prevalent among progressives, particularly among socialist intellectuals, because they object to the Jewish state narrative, to the idea that Jews should have their own nation. Karl Marx and Karl Kautsky, for instance, declared a society gains freedom only when it frees itself from Judaism, or rather when Judaism has disappeared. And given that doctrines such as these have become significantly more prevalent in universities over recent decades, it is unsurprising that this viewpoint has become so widespread among both established and aspiring academics.
I believe that post-colonial theories and decolonial currents are very important keywords in this context. So what function do these theories currently fulfill in this process of radicalization?
Well, they are, in essence, the academic expression of self-hatred, specifically Western self-hatred. They are precisely the product of Western universities, particularly those in America, that are heavily influenced by certain ideologies. They benefit from the Western system, but they condemn it. They don't even want to improve it. They want to dismantle it. And the outcome of these ideologies is that young Western children, teenage students, take to the streets and enthusiastically cheer on their future executioners. And if you look at a large group at Columbia University, the biggest pro-Palestinian group at Columbia University, they openly stated, "We are Westerners fighting for the total eradication of Western society." So translated, that means we are Westerners who advocate for the complete dismantling of Western civilization to completely dismantle itself. That's the result of intellectuals, not all, but of a particular intellectual school. They succeeded through various departments and even beyond their own in shaping the university's intellectual atmosphere and subsequently the broader Western zeitgeist. And all the debates we are having today, or rather the discussions we are avoiding, alongside this ignorance and inability to confront the significant threat we face in the West stemming from anti-Western structures, both in a geopolitical context and from within the Western world itself, that is essentially the outcome of this intellectual school.
And it's really difficult to counteract that, because for decades it has been presented as the one and only truth. So all these theories of neo-Marxism, post-colonialism, gender studies, you see, are presented as the sole truth, a truth so absolute and superior that no other nuances can possibly find their place. And various my generation and the generation before it were taught in university that the world is solely defined by a friend-enemy dichotomy, where the colonial, aggressive West is the enemy. The entire system of the West is virtually oppressive, and our students increasingly think within this Manichaean worldview, believing the world is composed solely of either oppressors and colonial masters, or the innocent, oppressed victims of Western supremacy. And then two developments occurred. The Islamists joined in and essentially engaged in free riding on these ideas, propagating these theories even more widely. The West, in turn, thought, well, if our Muslim fellow citizens are spreading this, then our theory must surely be valid, since this minority evidently feels oppressed by the West. The Islamists did this fully aware that the West, with its immense self-criticism, would instantly fall for it. And the West, as a matter of fact, did exactly that. He increasingly believed this lie, that the whole history of the West is inherently bad, that there's nothing positive about our history and our culture, and that the only appropriate path remaining for the West, the only thing that truly stays, would actually be to participate, as it were, in its own cultural suicide, if one might say so.
Yes, it's actually quite interesting, the concept of cultural hegemony by Gramsci, the Italian communist who described it. He conveyed that if an ideology possesses cultural hegemony and establishes itself as the only true and correct truth, then it essentially holds absolute and complete power. And what we've witnessed is that this cultural hegemony has essentially been accumulating over many years, and now for the first time there's a slight pushback, a questioning of the current state of affairs. However, I must warn against the belief that this movement has now in essence been stopped or completely vanquished, because if one looks at my generation and Franci's generation, you'll discover that a substantial portion, possibly as high as 40%, the exact figure varying depending on the nation you observe, consciously or subconsciously believes in these theories. And this generation, in turn, will advance into influential roles in the coming years, initially into significant positions and subsequently into leadership capacities. This implies we're facing a significant problem as a whole generation has been brought up under a misguided and self-destructive ideology. And if a generation, if the youth of a civilization no longer believes in itself, that civilization cannot survive. Because the only way forward is to believe in yourself, especially when things get tougher, in a multipolar world and in a world where we don't only have friends.
That's a good segue into the concept of wokeness. You two speak of a woke Islamist alliance. Would you be able to elaborate on that point? Maybe give an example for everyone who hasn't read your book yet. What do you mean by that? The term comes up quite often. So, we're talking about the ideological alliance of two groups, the woke and the Islamists, who couldn't be more different, but are united in their hatred of Western civilization, as we said earlier. On the one hand, we have radical leftists who completely adhere to the totalitarian influence system of wokeness, viewing the West as consistently colonialist, racist, and structurally oppressive. On the other hand, Islamists seek to establish an Islamic system of rule. So what is an Islamic system of rule? It would be the rejection of secularism, it would be the introduction of Sharia law, and it would be Islamic law as the absolute, total basis of the entire political order. And the link between these two factions, which as previously mentioned, truly appears highly paradoxical and contradictory, is their shared ambition to delegitimize the liberal democratic fundamental order of the West. And this alliance is particularly evident in academic institutions, where we witness woke and Islamist-leaning students standing shoulder to shoulder at pro-Palestinian demonstrations, and also in various media outlets and on the streets.
It is in essence the classic meme of queers for Palestine, chickens for KFC, which we discuss. However, we contend that this phenomenon did not arise by mere coincidence. It has historical precursors, particularly if one examines Foucault, who was fundamentally one of the originators of postmodernism, and who, essentially, he openly expressed his sympathies for the Islamist Mullah regime. This movement, and this alliance that everyone views and perceives as strange, is not accidental. It is sustained by a shared adversary, and that adversary is the West. And once this Western system is defeated, they will inevitably turn on each other and clash heads. More precisely, the Islamists will naturally prevail over the woke in that conflict. And one must characterize the woke, as we also describe it, as the politically and culturally protective power of Islamists, because they currently hold cultural hegemony, the political power, and the influence to steer politics, to influence politics, to direct the zeitgeist, and to shape the fabric of society and its politics in a way that essentially gives the Islamists complete freedom of action. However, the longer this process continues, the stronger the Islamists grow. They will eventually reach a point, which is relatively near, where they can act as an independent political force, no longer needing the woke as their political and cultural protectors.
You also discuss the alliance between elements of the left, Islamists, and elites, or perhaps even the financiers of elite universities, if I've understood you correctly. Could you perhaps explain with a very practical example what that looks like and how it works? It is an undeniable fact that diverse financial flows from various entities, such as China and Iran, to prestigious universities can indeed be substantiated. And all the actors involved there are accordingly actively engaged behind the scenes within certain groupings. Could you perhaps provide a brief overview of this situation?
Well, you can, if you consider American universities. Note that in recent years, authoritarian regimes, such as those just mentioned, Saudi Arabia, China, and sometimes Iran, have made payments to universities amounting to billions. Studies have shown that the greater the proportion of these payments to a university. This means the more a university is funded by Saudi Arabia, for instance, the higher the level of anti-Semitism found on those campuses. Because the narratives that are, let's say, favored by the financiers get pushed more and more. Seen a bit independently from that are the student groups that are forming, like, for example, Students for Justice in Palestine. They also disseminate the exact same message, which is anti-Western, anti-Israel. However, these groups are not directly financed by governments. At least there isn't a known direct connection at this point. They are financed through so-called charity organizations, which merely disguise themselves as welfare organizations. In truth, these organizations have collaborated for decades, particularly with Hamas, directly collecting funds for them. That was also clearly demonstrated and documented in US congressional reports. These organizations then splintered and re-established themselves under various new names. They essentially function as the primary financiers and orchestrators behind the campus protests we're currently witnessing. If we were to step away from academia, there is also a very concrete example of the alliance between leftist Islamists and elites, namely the Democratic Party in the US, at least portions of the Democrats, and Zoran Mamdani, who wants to become the next mayor of New York City and whose entire past has unequivocally demonstrated, taken a decidedly anti-Israel stance. His father is also a professor at Columbia University, and he taught and maintained precisely the same positions. And some Democrats are endorsing Zoran Mamdani's candidacy for what is arguably the most significant position, city of the West, or at least the West's most critical financial hub. That, of course, would have truly dreadful consequences if he were to be elected. And another example would be imams invited to mosques in Western countries who are openly advocating for the dismantling of the West, as happened recently in the US and has also been seen here just recently. Everything is allowed by so-called left liberal elites, who believe that all of this is part of multiculturalism, which we absolutely should not suppress. Another example we could also bring up is the millions in donations from Western governments that go to UNRWA, an organization that educates Palestinian children to harbor hatred for Jews and the United States, training them in the ways of martyrdom. And whether this alliance happens out of naivety or diabolical intent is actually irrelevant, because the result is always the same.
It must be clarified that the term elite is not meant in a conspiracy theory sense. So, somehow 5 people sit in a back room and decide how the world works. It's a sociological process that we're describing. Every society, no matter how democratic it may be, naturally possesses a specific social environment, an elite. This elite, while composed of diverse factions, nonetheless exerts a disproportionately significant influence on public discourse and the political landscape of a nation. And this includes journalists, the mainstream media, as it's also called, well-known public intellectuals, as they're called in English, as well as universities, politicians, lobbying organizations, consultants and the like, and also art and culture are included. And what we mean fundamentally is that there isn't one singular individual who accounts for everything, but instead, it is a sociological process because a certain leading idea is dominant, especially in this specific environment, and that is why politics is either pressured into action or operates from a profound conviction that aligns with this particular worldview. Don't get me wrong, it's not like there are 3 people sitting somewhere controlling all of this. No, it's a logical and unfolding process that we are observing. And what we propose is that one must understand the underlying process and the ideas that drive them. Subsequently, one should endeavor to persuade the elite to adopt an alternative approach, or through a counter-movement, cultivate a new elite composed of individuals who can be intellectually equipped with fresh, superior, new and improved ideas, and in doing so redirects the West onto an alternative course.
Do you perceive that there is already an elite functioning as a counter-movement in place? Or is it more of a marginal issue that still needs to be actively developed and nurtured?
So, to build it up and expand on it most definitely, America is significantly more intriguing than Europe in that respect. I think, to broadly summarize, the vast majority of ordinary citizens and people inherently understand that things are headed in the wrong direction, and that an idea which they haven't quite grasped the full implications of yet, that is leading us in this particular direction. However, there is not a full agreement on what the counter-reaction should actually look like, because many individuals are still thinking within the frameworks of this quite outdated concept. A significant number still feel impressed, influenced, and even intimidated by this very idea. And on the other hand, there's no unanimity on how things should actually be. That side is also divided. It is fundamentally held together by a common political adversary, but if it were to theoretically come to power, then in my opinion, there would be interfactional disputes about what it could and should look like.
Würde es meiner Meinung nach interfraktionelle Streitigkeiten geben, wie es aussehen könnte und aussehen müsste.
What we are suggesting is that fundamentally the bourgeoisie, as we describe it, the people who want things to be different, we must understand how these sociological processes unfold and begin to liberate ourselves from this culturally dominant mindset in order to establish a completely new one. A new one that can be based on old traditions, but which also includes the future and has the courage, basically, to ask the power question for the first time. Exactly what that might look like, neither of us has the answer to that right now. That would provide enough text for many more books. However, we put forward the proposal, or rather the thesis, that if one has this claim to power, universities are the crucial location, because that is where the elite of tomorrow receives its education. If the elite of tomorrow is lost to a particular idea, then the Western world will continue on this trajectory into the future.
And before we begin, another good foundation, specifically directed at the media and politics, would be that one shouldn't always attempt to suppress everything under the pretext of combating right-wing extremism. Thus, much of the content that challenges the anti-Western, anti-Israeli elite has utterly no connection to right-wing extremism. Yet, over recent years, many in the media have conveniently chosen to categorize anything that diverges from this particular standard, that is, from the left liberal viewpoint, as right-wing extremist. And in doing so, we have also lost the original meaning of the term right-wing extremist. And when you are publicly shamed with the right-wing extremist label, many naturally hesitate to express the counter-opinion we are looking for, the counter-opinion that would be good. That doesn't mean there aren't any truly right-wing extremists according to the original definition, but many from that very right-wing extremist spectrum are, of course, also very anti-Semitic and very anti-Israeli. So, if one really makes the effort, then one can indeed distinguish well between who truly strives for the West, who would genuinely form a good part of a counter-elite, and who profits from the polarized debate about the West's future merely for their own extreme agenda.
The essential question, in essence, is whether this immense anger, this deep-seated frustration, and this surging energy can be constructively directed towards something beneficial, or if it will ultimately prove destructive, leading to the complete ruin of everything. What has actually been built up here? And the intellectual and political future of this counter-movement must pose this very specific question to itself.
When we look at the responsibilities, in the German academic landscape or even the American university landscape, to what extent would you say that professors, institutions, and foundations share responsibility for what you're describing? I just want to address the larger universities in Berlin, where one might perceive that anti-Semitism commissioners exist. However, what these anti-Semitism commissioners ultimately say or do following any instances of occupation, I would not describe as constructive in solving the problem of anti-Semitism. And in the US, I have read similar sections from your writings. Perhaps you could both briefly explain that further.
Well, regarding the anti-Semitism commissioners, you could say it's always just a political tool to basically show that you're doing something. The issue naturally runs far deeper, and an anti-Semitism officer won't accomplish anything, particularly because they're hired by the very university they'd be compelled to openly criticize. The issue is far more profound, and we are encountering either professors and leadership who are fearful of their own academic staff and employees, or who completely endorse the sentiments expressed by their staff and the students, that is, those engaged in these protests. The core question is what to do with an academic system. This question arises in America and Europe, that in theory should self-correct, that theoretically ought to be free from ideology, that must be open to open discussion, and which should not allow itself to be co-opted. But what do we do with this system, when it fails? Do we continue to pay for it, or how can we, in a legally proper way, essentially reform the system and exert pressure so that it once again moves in the right direction without fighting against science freedom? We don't fully address that question in its entirety within the book. We have proposals for what should be done, among other things, but the most important point is also to understand politically that one cannot simply demand that universities, through a mere statement, address this problem. Instead, it requires pressure from the media, pressure from civil society, pressure from politics, and importantly, it also necessitates pressure from within academia itself, to assert that the direction we are heading in is fundamentally incorrect. And in America, we're further ahead on this issue because pressure came not just from the conservative side, but also from classical liberals, like Steven Pinker, a renowned Harvard psychologist, who similarly cautions against this ideological appropriation of universities. These are courageous voices, and in Germany you have to rely on these courageous voices, you have to look for them, you have to support them, and you have to create a movement that reclaims the universities from these ideologues.
So what's the situation in the US? Trump has cut funding. Have there been any successes observed from that approach? Would you say that some more progress has already been made in this regard to address the issue of anti-Semitism and violence on campus? Well, the one truly tangible outcome, which wasn't a direct result of Trump's actions, but at least stemmed from the pressure he exerted, is the establishment of a Center for Conservative Scholarship at Harvard University. This initiative represents a positive move towards reintroducing a greater diversity of thought within academia, as we noted previously, that the learned worldview previously taught across many disciplines is Manichaean, split between oppressor and oppressed, and with this center, it would become a bit more diversified. Various grey tones in between would also be explored. As for the question of whether anti-Semitism itself will change because of this, we'll have to wait and see what the new year brings. The new semester in the US just began days ago at most universities. What we've observed is that there have once again been pro-Palestinian demonstrations and disruptions caused by this group. So of course it won't just disappear because of that, but we can assume that some universities that have recognized the pressure will try to create more consequences. But it could also be, of course, that we will continue to find ourselves in the battle between a Trump administration and, for example, Harvard University or other universities that won't accept this so easily, and then we can continue to deal with lawsuits against each side next year without anything actively changing on campus. But what's also a significant step, undoubtedly, speaking as someone who studied there and interacted with numerous fellow students possessing this dangerous mindset, yet was still permitted to study in the US, is certainly that applicants for studies, as is more meticulously scrutinized in the US, scrutinize more closely, looking at what they actually spread, their opinions, and what they've posted on social media. Based on this, a decision is made whether to issue them a visa. I think that's a very good decision. In the German media, this has so far been described as very one-sided, as not a sound decision, or as a totalitarian characteristic of the Trump administration. However, considering it within the university context and the disruption students from other countries who, despite their anti-American sentiments, still wish to study there can cause, then one can certainly only endorse such a measure.
And regardless of the nation, it must be understood that we are dealing with a certain environment that, for more than 2 years, has been unable to consistently take action against students and activists, many of whom are not even enrolled, who openly align with Islamists, or at least openly show sympathy for them, and then also use violence. If this had originated from a different political faction, specifically from a right-wing extremist group, then there would undoubtedly be protests led by professors and widespread open letters. Many actions would need to be undertaken. Thus, it presents a significant political problem. It's not merely an organizational issue, but rather a societal environment that lacks had the will or the genuine desire to take action, and whether it is enough to simply pull some money from them or exert public or internal pressure, I question that. No, there are some people who join in for purely opportunistic reasons, but there are also people who are basically the leading figures of this milieu and steer it in a certain direction, and we mustn't forget that. Moreover, one must also not overlook that it might all conclude within a single legislative term. It could also be that for 4 whole years we hear nothing at all, because essentially there is a tactical silence in the universities, and they are simply biding their time, waiting for the next opportune government to take power, or for the topic to simply vanish from the media, and then they'll just continue as before. If one examines universities, then fundamentally in Germany, but also in the USA, very little to nothing has been accomplished, and if we examine the situation 10 years down the line, it's highly probable we'll find, as things currently stand, that a significant portion of young individuals in academia are still being steered in a certain direction.
The first university administration in Berlin has already announced that they expect further occupations to take place. Among other things, you also wrote about Masar Badil, a group with Islamist terror connections that was present at Humboldt University on May 22, 2024. How do these collaborations even happen, and how do they get into the universities? I mean, how should we picture that? Are external actors now influencing and co-determining the direction of student groups? How do these developments actually come into being?
Usually not just external ones. You basically have students at every university, or rather student groups at many universities, and they're usually called something like Students for Palestine XY. Then there are groups often mentioned in the Constitutional Protection Report. You once named Sabadil. There are also the Revolutionary Left and Workers' Power and various similar groups that are brought up in that context. And these groups are a specific community that maintain close contact, frequently post content jointly, consequently influencing many followers, share online interactions, and together plan and call for actions. And that's why basically almost every occupation is a mix of students and external people who are brought in by students. One must understand this as a phenomenon that these students also attend demonstrations outside the university. It is simply a milieu that is active throughout Berlin, and indeed not just in Berlin but across all of Germany. And we mentioned, for instance, that on the anniversary of October 7th, a letter emerged from 36 pro-Palestinian student organizations who explicitly stated that the rape of Israeli women was Israeli propaganda, and that this resistance, referring to October 7th, was in fact legitimate resistance. And they are organized and interconnected all throughout Germany. So you can see it's a tight network that extends into extremism, from anti-constitutional activities to extremists are going. It's monitored by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, and yet it can get in and essentially do whatever it pleases at our universities, because there have been practically no house bans or convictions.
Yes, in the USA it's the same situation in that respect. There we have the problem that students in the USA, there are much stricter rules about who is even allowed into the university, who is allowed on the grounds at all. At Columbia University, the NYPD was on campus 24/7, controlling entry. They strictly monitored who could enter and who could not. Only those with a university ID could enter. You would have thought that would work, but many students always found a way to bring non-students, and as such, agitators, very prominent agitators, onto campus with them and then organize the protests there together. So we kept seeing people who either weren't students, who had long been banned from campus, who were suspended from the university because of their behavior, who always managed to get back on campus. People find loopholes. Unfortunately, it's unstoppable. And in the USA, we continue to face the issue where numerous prominent democratic representatives who were demonstrably mouthpieces for the Muslim Brotherhood were extended invitations to campus, subsequently creating a significantly larger commotion there. And naturally, a representative cannot be denied campus access solely due to their prominence. At least we haven't quite reached that stage yet. It might be possible, but it's currently not being implemented. And so the wheel keeps turning without much you can do to counter it.
And you also observe connections between anti-Israeli and anti-Western narratives, in addition to Russian propaganda. That also seems to play a small role in everything, doesn't it? Do you see this connection clearly, or would you say that's just an assumption?
Yes, that connection exists, because in Germany there was a platform called Red, which was extensively covered by the Taz and Tagesspiegel newspapers. At least we quoted them. They cooperated with the students who were occupying the space there. They live-streamed parts of it. They created shareable pictures, so they posted things together. So that cooperation definitely exists. And it's really no wonder that it exists, because it naturally leads to supporting a milieu and a political movement that, from a Russian perspective, obviously aims to destabilize and abolish the West. And in that sense, that naturally supports Russia's political agenda. Russia.
The same can absolutely be said for China. Many group affiliations on American campuses can also be indirectly traced back to the Communist Party of China. And China, just like Russia, naturally has a significant interest in simply stirring up unrest within the USA, which is considered China's biggest enemy. Not necessarily because they have a strong opinion on Israel or Palestine, but they want to stir up civil unrest, civil disobedience, and division in society. This can be said for both Russia and China, yes.
And this connection between anti-Western sentiment and anti-Israeli sentiment is fundamentally rooted in the fact that it originates from essentially the same. When we discuss the political left, it arises from an identical way of thinking. You can't, in essence, use them interchangeably as synonyms. However, it's the same mentality that views this particular state or civilization as inherently evil, and therefore it must be eradicated. And that's why the West is insulted as white, colonialist, and so on and so forth, and that's why Israel is insulted as white, colonialist, and so on and so forth. It's the same terminology, and it's the same thinkers it can be traced back to. Essentially, they are the same activists. It is a particular environment that shares a common adversary. That adversary is the West, and it is Israel. Regrettably, the West has not grasped this situation currently, and furthermore, its political leadership is significantly shaped by the influences of this particular movement. And it is essentially crucial that the citizens of the Western world grasp the understanding that this particular movement is anti-Western, and that they should not fall for this anti-Israeli narrative, because I am currently observing that many are essentially realizing that this woke movement is dangerous, but they continue to think within their established thought patterns when it comes to Israel, instead of comprehending that what they are currently conceptualizing stems from the same, is a movement that they are only now beginning to perceive as a political adversary. So, would you then say that there are parallels between the USA, Germany, and European universities concerning the actors in the development? And what are the biggest differences? Where are the parallels located? Can you identify them?
Well, in the USA, we actually see the origin of all these culture war-related things, if you want to put it that way. It always starts there and then spills over to Europe after a bit of a delay. In the USA, leftist Islamist narratives were set up decades ago. Radical networks are well organized, partly due to the size of the country, sometimes better organized than in Germany or Europe, and are very, very strongly embedded within the elites. I'm talking about Keyword, Mamdani, and Mamdani's father at Columbia University. We see these parallels in Germany and other European countries. The language is the same: anti-Zionism, decolonization, resistance, rape and resistance, and so on. The difference is perhaps that in Germany, paradoxically, the response is the weakest, even though we actually have a historical responsibility from the last century.
Yes, Franziska quite well described the parallel. America is always faster, so the counter-movement is already present, even if it's not entirely unified. In Europe, it's slowly taking shape, but it's significantly slower. And therefore, I predict, in that sense, I'm of the opinion that in 5 to 10 years at the latest, we will find ourselves in the exact same situation that America is currently experiencing. But it could also be that it comes even faster because Trump is accelerating the process in that sense. And if the economic crisis escalates even further, and if, for instance, we experience terrorist attacks and similar events, then this process could unfold at an even faster pace. The question is whether Europe is brave enough, or rather if Europeans possess the courage, similar to a segment of Americans, to fully initiate this counter-process and counter-movement, and subsequently to follow through with it to completion.
They should be braver because in Europe our geographical location alone means we're quite surrounded, and our political and foreign policy security is at risk, especially in Germany, just due to our location. The Americans have a pretty big advantage there, as they always do actually. But still, as Norma already said, they are quicker to recognize it and quicker to form a counter-movement. Perhaps it's also somewhat related to the fact that Americans are generally more devout Christians, and many of them may already recognize the religious struggle within this, whereas in Europe, which is now characterized by a very secular society, it's not immediately perceived as such. Not through the lens of religions that may eventually have to fight against each other at some point.
And Europe naturally finds itself in this magical triangle where it conducts trade with the USA and in return receives security. You negotiate good agreements with China and you get inexpensive gas from Russia. That's how a world could be pieced together, one that in reality never existed. In contrast, in America, they've always grasped geopolitics, understood war as such, and comprehended ideological struggles. In Germany or in Europe, you could afford to basically ignore that. But especially if the USA and Germany become increasingly estranged, or rather, if Europe is no longer a priority for the USA, then Europe must mature for the first time and understand that the world is not solely comprised of friends, but that there are ideological and cultural battles that must be fought to avoid going under.
I would say that over the past 3 months there has definitely been a significant and noticeable explosion in anti-Semitic incidents across Europe. There was a scholarly letter advocating for Israel's exclusion from academic institutions and universities and so on and so forth. Do you feel that the theories presented in your book are being confirmed? Or do you have the impression that reality has already moved beyond these analyses since you wrote them down?
We always knew that things could escalate given the circumstances we've experienced, and looking back historically at the last century, it was always evident to us that it could certainly worsen.
Yes, I definitely see it confirmed, and in essence, the next few months will probably confirm the whole thing. I believe the question is simply what one makes of it. Unfortunately, it has taken longer for Europe, and particularly for Germany, to recognize this movement as a political and ideological adversary. And we try to think one step further and say, all right, we've described the adversary, but what steps do we take against it? Instead of merely complaining or grumbling within your own circles, the question is, where are the crucial points in society and politics where we can intervene and turn the tide? And we suggest, of course, that one would have to take a closer look at the universities, tackle them, and develop a strategy on how to regain a foothold there and turn the tide.
So what happens if we don't manage to turn the tide? I mean, what development do you foresee for universities, society, and education? What consequences, what kind of development would you predict?
Yes, fundamentally, Europe, let's primarily talk about Europe for a moment. Europe is essentially destroying itself, both culturally and in a civilizational sense, in an economic sense of the term, and consequently will no longer possess any influence in global affairs, effectively transforming into a failed continent rather than what we would typically envision as a failed state. This isn't something to be expected in the next 10 years, but rather a continuous decline accompanied by escalating tension due to the influence of Islamists, coupled with significant economic hardships and emergency conditions, which cultivates an almost insurmountable or extremely challenging situation, to envision a positive future, a future where Europe can once again assume a leading role on the global stage and rediscover its former strength.
If we apply this same scenario to the USA, it would naturally have far worse implications, much stronger consequences for the whole world. Then we can completely write off the hegemony, the Western hegemony that we all grew up in, that 2 or 3 generations before us grew up in, because then we will find ourselves in a system that fluctuates between theocratic and totalitarian. It depends entirely on which other power would then step in and fill the void left by the USA.
What needs to happen? What specifically needs to happen for the process of intellectual self-destruction to be at least stopped or slowed down? Do we currently have politicians who, let's say, have been elected, whom you would trust to be able to stop this process?
Not in Germany right now, because I honestly don't find myself aligned with any particular party. Do I see a well-known politician who is brave enough, perhaps they think it privately, but who possesses the courage and holds a suitable position to comprehend the issue in its entirety, and has the strength and the charisma to fundamentally persuade individuals and society to embark on this particular course of action? One reason for this with the CDU, for example, is that they are basically very quickly satisfied with just being in power, and basically gives little consideration to what should actually happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and in part allows itself to be very strongly shaped by the cultural hegemony of the left. And because of that, I am also of the opinion that we shouldn't just wait for politicians, but for civil society to act. Essentially, what needs to emerge from civil society is a civic or an extra-parliamentary opposition, one that is intellectually grounded, supported by a fresh perspective or a new vision that subsequently shapes political outcomes. I don't think we should wait for politics. First, we have to create the intellectual foundation. That's what intellectuals must do, what citizens must do, what associations must be engaged in, and what movements must participate in. A new political direction will then emerge from that, instead of simply waiting for that one politician to arrive and turn the tide. That politician is usually the product of a movement that was previously conceived and established.
Of course, one must also recognize that politics creates further opportunities for civil society to carry out these very actions. That was clear with the Trump versus Biden administrations. Under Trump, much more happened concerning Israel than anyone expected under Biden, and it likely wouldn't have happened under Kamala Harris either. Under Trump, some universities were taught a lesson, leading them to better protect their Jewish students and to no longer tolerate terrorist attitudes on campus. As a student, you felt the contrast very strongly yourself if you studied there under those administrations. Therefore, I would argue that with figures like Trump and several prominent Republican politicians, we already have exemplary leaders who are distinctly committed to this trajectory, including engaging civilization scholars in their endeavors. This doesn't mean one should endorse every aspect, as, particularly in Germany, Republicans are consistently depicted in the most negative manner. However, a crucial point often overlooked is that it's predominantly Republicans who actively take a stand against anti-Semitism and and terrorist ideologies. And one very specific thing that perhaps we can also impart to the podcast listeners is that every individual who cares deeply about the West should, so to speak, reflect on or discard the notion that we, as Europeans, as Americans, as Western civilization, ought to feel any shame whatsoever. Therefore, we, as Western civilization, have accomplished more good than bad for mankind. We don't need to be consumed by self-hatred. In fact, we simply cannot afford it. We must relearn to appreciate and protect the achievements of Western civilization. After the so-called end of history, as described by the renowned political scientist Francis Fukuyama following the Cold War, the West, so to speak, effectively fell into a void. The West was completely unprepared to defend its very own foundational principles. And we need to identify exactly that again. What are Western principles and how can we best stand up for them?
Thank you. That was indeed the last question. Perhaps each of you would like to offer a final statement about your book, your analysis, or your central argument to briefly conclude our discussion. If there was one sentence you absolutely had to choose or that you'd want to say regarding your book, what would that be?
I believe that one crucial statement to make is this: the era of postmodern, self-loathing decolonization of the West has caused significant damage and destruction. But now it is truly time to initiate the era of reconstruction for a much improved, prosperous, and beautiful future ahead.
If we desire to preserve our Western heritage, we need to guide ourselves by the pillars of mindfulness, gratitude, and courage. And this holds true for all of society, for each individual.
Thank you very much. I also highly recommend reading it. Thanks for being here today and for the fascinating insights, especially into your book. And the interview itself can also be commented on and discussed further more on that. And you can find out more about the book on Mena-Watch. I also want to wish both of you all the best. Thank you again for the conversation.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Thinktank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.